The year is 1991, and a charismatic John Romero had recently formed a new division at the computer magazine and software company known as Softdisk. John Romero had spent most of his life wanting to make games, and Softdisk gave him that opportunity. Little did he know, though, that this would be the start of his and 3 other people's legacy. Romero, alongside John Carmack, Adrian Carmack, and Tom Hall, would later revolutionize the gaming industry 3 different times. However, nothing would shape the industry as much as their 1996 release, Quake. Quake not only set the standard for first-person shooters, it spawned a billion-dollar industry, and with their open-source engine, helped provide a base for some of gaming's most played titles. This is 25 years of Quake, the story of id Software. Quake dates back farther than its release, though. The Lovecraftian world got its start from Commander Keen, id Software's first innovation towards PC gaming. The game id Software wanted to make at the time would have been called Quake: The Fight for Justice, and was featured as a promo at the end of the Commander Keen trilogy. The Fight for Justice was going to be a 3D side-scroller, featuring the main protagonist Quake, a character taken directly out of John Carmack's D&D campaign. Quake was the strongest, most feared person on the continent, and would fight for a secret organization known as Justice, whose main goal was to eradicate evil from their land. Quake would wield a powerful hammer, known as the Hammer of Thunderbolts, to help smite the horrors before him. He also had access to the Ring of Regeneration and a trans-dimensional artifact. The game's development started in 1991, but was quickly shelved due to technological constraints. The Fight for Justice wanted to feature fully 3D backgrounds, complex characters, and puzzles that would require you to correlate time and events with the characters you would meet. The time for Quake was nigh, but unfortunately would be put on the back burner. After Commander Keen had released, it had established that PC gaming wasn't out for the count compared to home consoles. id Software had a special weapon to prove this, and his name was John Carmack. Carmack was the lead programmer at id, and he was no short of a genius. Commander Keen, for its time, was considered impossible for PCs to handle. This was because they didn't have the computing power for side-scrolling. It was John Carmack who came up with a solution to this problem. Carmack, alongside his co-workers at id, released the first of its kind on PCs, a stable side-scroller that featured complex colors and graphics. It would be disingenuous to say that John Carmack was the sole reason that id Software succeeded as a company, but he was a major component to their newfound success. Before the Fight for Justice got shelved, John Carmack was fast ahead, working on what would be established as the id Tech engine. What do you get when you mix Nazis, guns, and a super soldier-like protagonist who's out for blood? Wolfenstein 3D. Wolfenstein was again no short of a masterpiece for its time. First-person games existed, but were often slow, using tank-like controls and turn-based combat. Wolfenstein changed that, innovating the PC space yet again. The game featured free movement, being able to turn, move, and shoot in real time. Wolfenstein laid the foundation for FPS games. However, the game wasn't free of controversy. In Germany at the time, it was illegal to portray Nazis in any way, and thus Wolfenstein 3D was banned from the country. This didn't stop gamers of the 90s from playing the game though. id Software was not only the first to invent the first-person shooter genre, but also the first to have it banned from an entire country. This painted the company as a sort of counterculture movement, and would largely help bring id Software into the limelight. But it wasn't until their next game that they would really shine. Enter Doom. Doom wasn't just another piece of the puzzle towards defining what an FPS is. In essence, Doom was everything that id Software had worked towards. It featured their counterculture style that people had come to love. Instead of Nazi slang, it featured a lone marine fighting the forces of hell. Up to this point, Doom had featured the most realistic-looking graphics at the time, and this worried many people. How would this affect their kids psychologically? This spawned a huge movement to ban sexualized and violent content from video games, which would then lead to the creation of the ESRB, a rating system to categorize video games into age groupings. However, this rarely ever stopped gamers, and Doom was a huge success.
These games are getting really realistic. Next year I might even play in the big Doom tournament.
Doom had finally grabbed the attention of a mainstream audience. This propelled the team at id Software into rock stardom. Things weren't all smooth sailing though, and with the release of Doom, it saw the departure of one of id's founding members. Tom Hall was the lead designer for Doom, and he had a vision. Doom had to be the game that defined id Software, and the work he put into it was immense. But his ideas clashed with the rest of the team. Even before development had fully started, Tom Hall had a detailed document about how Doom was to be developed and designed. This was referred to as the Doom Bible. Kind of ironic, huh? Needless to say, the Doom Bible was scrapped, and this annoyed Hall. This happened because the team had never used the design document before, so why would they now? Doom had created a rift between the team and Hall. There would be numerous disputes throughout the game's development, mostly being Hall versus Carmack. It's really important to recognize that while Hall was the lead designer, Carmack was often the source of inspiration within the company. Tom Hall had this grand idea for Doom, wanting to fill the void that Wolfenstein left behind plot-wise. Carmack had not only hated this idea, but entirely dismissed it, saying story in a game is like story in a porn movie. It's expected to be there, but it's not that important. These arguments between Hall and Carmack are key for the history of id, because ultimately Hall would be fired from id by Carmack and the other founders. 2 months later, Hall's role at id was filled by Sandy Peterson, just 10 weeks before Doom's release. Leading up to the release, id Software was working on the multiplayer component of the game. Eventually, the team was playing 4-player multiplayer Doom games. Romero coined this type of play as deathmatch. A huge inspiration for their multiplayer variants came from fighting games. This was because id regularly played games like Street Fighter, Fatal Fury, and The Art of Fighting. Doom released, and id Software would yet again be cast into the spotlight as many were anticipating what would come next from the company. Let's backtrack for a second. In between Commander Keen and Doom, id Software had made various games for Softdisk as part of a legal agreement. However, the two most important games up to the release of Wolfenstein and Doom are often overlooked. The first of the two was Hovertank 3D. This was the third game that id Software had released, and it set the stage for the company's future projects. Hovertank, from a gameplay perspective, was simple. However, from a technical perspective, it was complex. Carmack wrote the engine in just 6 weeks, which was 2 weeks longer than the previous projects that did. Historically, these graphics were groundbreaking and provided a base for their next two important releases, Catacombs 3D and Wolfenstein 3D. For Catacombs 3D, the base engine of Hovertank 3D was expanded to include texture mapping. This allowed for textures to be mapped to the environment instead of having solid colors. However, the team felt that the game lacked any sort of coolness and fun that Commander Keen had. This was just the second building block for the team that would ultimately push them towards a fully 3D game, with Wolfenstein adding ray tracing to the engine. Finally, 6 years after their first release, id Software had been on an incredible journey, and things were about to get even more wild. Following the critically acclaimed Doom 2 came Quake. From making a 2D side-scroller to pseudo-3D environments, the team had one goal for their next game: a fully 3D world where the player could feel complete immersion. After its initial concept of a fully 3D side-scroller, Quake had headed towards a third-person melee combat game. This was inspired by yet another fighting game named Virtua Fighter by Sega AM2. However, this concept was quickly scrapped after the team thought it was too risky. Quake's concept was finally narrowed down after 5 years. It was to be the second fully 3D FPS, that is, if you count Battlezone as the first. Quake was to run faster and more efficiently, in part because of technology advancing and the black magic programming that John Carmack had done to optimize the game. Around this time, John Romero would start to lose interest within the company. He felt that id Software became too corporate and limited the creative aspects on which id was founded on. Romero was largely absent from the development of Quake, and his role was filled by Sandy Petersen. Sandy Petersen was largely credited for making Quake so Lovecraftian, and the team loved it. Also joining the development team was American McGee. Before American McGee's game design role, he was doing technical support for the company via phone lines. His role with developing Quake was very simple, yet extremely complex. He was to be the Foley artist, taking sounds provided by Nine Inch Nails to craft new noises that would enhance the player's immersion. Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails also did the soundtrack for the game. Reznor was a huge fan of the studio, with his favorite game being Doom, and many people within id Software were huge fans of Nine Inch Nails themselves, and so a mutual partnership was established. Quake was to feature a silent protagonist. He would be unnamed but would be referred to as Ranger. Ranger was sent through a portal to fight an enemy with the codename Quake. At the time, the government was developing and working on technology now known as slipgates, which essentially are powerful teleportation devices that had been stolen by Quake. Quake had a plan to send legions upon legions of death squads to what he referred to as the human realm to conquer and test the capabilities of humans. Ranger was the only one of his squad to survive being teleported, and he pushed on with Operation Counter-Strike, fighting the legions of evil brought forth by Quake. Ranger would realize he needed the 4 magic runes from the dimension of which Quake hailed from. The 4 runes being Rune of Earth from the dimension of the Doom, Rune of Black Magic from the realm of Black Magic, Rune of Hell from the Netherworld, and finally, the Rune of Elder Magic found in the Elderworld. With the power of these 4 runes, Ranger would be able to beat Quake, who is revealed to be the ruler of all monsters within the game's reality. While entirely 3D graphics weren't new, most people believed and theorized that such graphics were incapable of running on a PC because of how much computing power was required. John Carmack would find a way to prove the world wrong again, which, by this point, had been his way of saying "screw you, universe." Quake featured a multitude of technical feats that were achieved by Carmack, which pushed Quake to the center of gaming. However, with the release of Quake, the company would suffer a major blow internally. While not the sole founder, the person who initially conceived of the company, John Romero, would be fired. Quake was released and the world was stunned. It was an instant hit, and was the start of something big. Carmack knew this, and like a blacksmith working on a piece of hot iron, kept hammering away at his creation, the id Tech engine. Quake featured gameplay similar to Doom, focusing on a linear, fast-paced experience with close to zero downtime between traversing levels and killing enemies. It featured 8 weapons in total, where the player could freely switch between them once collected. These weapons would not only leave a lasting impact within Quake, but would also gain global recognition as video games progressed into the future. These weapons are the Axe, Shotgun, Super Shotgun, Nail Gun, Super Nail Gun, Grenade Launcher, Rocket Launcher, and the Thunderbolt, which would later become known as the Lightning Gun. With the birth of Quake came many firsts, setting in stone how the controls of an FPS game should be. Most importantly, it required a fun multiplayer experience. With creating this experience, id Software had unknowingly created an industry that within time would reach global popularity, known as esports. Nowadays, when speaking of Quake, it's pretty much assumed you were talking about the high-octane competitive gameplay. But back then, this was all new. Landing for Quake at your friend's house was increasing in popularity, and so was the need to compete. This is where online play exploded. You could easily boot up the game, connect to a dedicated server, and deathmatch with your friends, or complete strangers. While deathmatching was the most popular way to play online, Quake featured co-op play, and what is seen as a mainstay in the franchise, Duel. Quake was also highly moddable, as id wrote their own programming language for the game, known as Quake C. id Software would eventually release the source code for their engine, which gave everyday programmers the opportunity to build their own game with id Tech. Many discoveries would come with the creation of Quake that would transcend game development as a whole. Mental and mechanical differences separated the good from the bad. With the birth of competitive gaming came the search for tech within the shooter. Movement like rocket jumping, bunny hopping, and strafe jumping would all become synonymous with Quake. This pushed Quake to a whole new level. Quake was starting to transition into a competitive era. It would be about who could be the best at the multiplayer. Quake was the birth of something big, and id Software would take notice of this. Later that year, a group of fans from the EFNet IRC network shared a desire to meet each other from the Quake chat and rented out a hotel room from Best Western, just a mile away from the id Software offices. Jim H2H Elson and Yossarian Yasman Holmberg started planning the event, and interest started to build from others. The event was to be called Quakecon and was to take place on August 15, 1996. It started with just 30 people arriving, but over the course of the event, had more than 100 people show up and attend, thanks to news spreading from chat room to chat room. This included the id Software team, who showed up, chatted with fans, and played some Quake with the crowd of people. This first QuakeCon would start a tradition for John Carmack, where he would have his own panel to talk about the various aspects of making video games. This would be known as Carmack's Talks, or better yet, John Carmack's Keynote. The event also had a BYOC. This was a designated area where you could bring your own computer. This led to people playing via LAN connection and eventually led into organizing a duel tournament for the event to crown the first ever QuakeCon champion. But in this case, it was technically two, since they also set up a Doom 2 1v1 tournament as well. The winner of these two events were Remedy, winning the Quake portion of the event, and Polish winning the Doom 2 tournament. While Duel was the main event at the first QuakeCon, it would adopt various other games and modes in the future events. From this point forward, Quake would be an industry icon when it came to the creation and growth of esports, leading games like Counter-Strike, StarCraft, and many more to adopt competitive multiplayer events. Most notably would come competitive gaming's first major icon, Dennis Thresh Fong. While most kids today probably wouldn't recognize him, he was considered the first professional gamer. Thresh was cast into stardom inside Quake when he famously won John Carmack's 1987 Ferrari 328 GTS and $5,000 at the Red Annihilation tournament held by Intergraph. Quake II's development, like Quake I, had a rocky start. The team initially didn't want their next game to be a sequel. After playing around with titles such as Strogg and Lock and Load, the team felt no success with them and opted to continue the Quake franchise, naming the game Quake II. However, Quake II wouldn't focus on Lovecraftian horrors, but towards a sci-fi theme. Introducing Bitterman, a marine who was sent to the home planet of Strogos to stop the Strogg from launching an invasion on Earth. The Strogg are a hostile race and are hellbent on taking over Earth and using the humans to advance the Strogg civilization. This is because the Strogg used advanced cybernetics to take host bodies and control them with mind chips. Unfortunately, upon arriving at Strogos, every marine is slaughtered or captured for Stroggification. This is the process of turning a host body into a Strogg. Bitterman survives because an escape pod hits his ship upon entry, and he lands short of the operation site. It's up to Bitterman to save the Earth by infiltrating the Strogg civilization and killing their ruler known as the Macron. To id Software, Quake II was a chance to right all the wrongs of the first game. While ultimately being successful, Quake's story wasn't liked by the team. With Romero gone, this was their chance to quote-unquote reinvent the series. This was in part to Kevin Cloud taking Romero's spot, and he wanted Quake to be more story-driven. Needless to say, the team was in a weird spot, but was happy to be working on the game. All that was left for was John Carmack to upgrade the id Tech engine. This led to him reprogramming client-server relations, which had allowed them to change various entities on the fly. Its biggest feature was support for hardware acceleration with OpenGL on launch. Quake II had 4 main objectives for the single player. First, you must establish a communication uplink so that you can contact the military and tell them what's going on. Secondly, you have to destroy the planet's defense system so that your backup can come and help you stop the Strogg. This was a big reason for why the initial assault failed, because the military underestimated the capabilities of the Big Gun, Strogos' planetary defense. Thirdly, you have to disable their interplanetary gateway. This lies at the center of Strogos' capital city. It's a large-scale black hole generator which allows for instantaneous transportation to any planet they want. Finally, it's up to you to find and assassinate the Macron, leader of the Strogg. While Quake II was still in development, the second QuakeCon had come and gone. This event saw a roughly 4.3 times increase in attendance, mostly due to better planning and spreading awareness. This event also saw sponsorship from id Software and Activision as a way to promote awareness for Quake II. Quakecon 97's duel event saw many more entries than the year prior, with first place going to Rick's. Overall, Quakecon 97 was a huge success for id, Activision, and the fans of Quake alike. Quake II released December 9th, 1997. Over the course of a year, it had sold 1 million copies and was one of the most sold games of 1998. However, history repeats itself, and with another successful launch, the company suffered from more internal strife, with many people leaving the company, including Jay Wilbur, id Software's original business manager, and American McGee, who had helped design levels for Doom 2, Quake, and Quake II, while managing the music aspect of the game. However, both John and Adrian Carmack were feeling good with the success of Quake II, and quickly started work on their next game, Quake III. Unfortunately, the team was starting to really feel the effects of losing Romero. For the first time in the company's history, their next game would be multiplayer only. They would focus more on the technical aspects, rather than how fun the game was. This isn't to say that Quake III was bad by any means, however, it lacked the charm of the previous games. Quake III ran id Tech 3, which brought numerous changes to the prior versions and allowed for, again, better graphics. It used a shader system which allowed for textures to have additional defined properties known as shader scripts. id Tech 3 also integrated spline curves and planar volumes, which allowed for more intricate detail. Not only was id Tech 3 allowing for more detail, but it also offered vertex animation with attachment tags. This meant models could move independently of each other, allowing for characters to have more detailed animations without the computing cost or file size of fully animated models. Ironically enough, one of the main features that helped define Quake, strafe jumping, was initially hated by John Carmack. In a set of what can be considered devlogs, Carmack goes over various changes that are being made to Quake III. Carmack can be quoted saying, "Strafe jumping is an exploitable bug. Just because people have practiced hard to allow themselves to take advantage of it does not justify its existence. When I tried fixing the code so that it just didn't work, I thought it changed the normal running movement in an unfortunate way." This would ultimately be the last update to what is now called the Carmack Diaries. What's interesting to really look at as well is how he had a somewhat epiphany within the same update, saying, "Some reasonable messages have convinced me that a single immediate jump after landing may be important to gameplay. I'll experiment with it." He would then go on to say that he prefers Quake without strafe jumping, pulling from movie icons such as Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sigourney Weaver, saying they didn't get down a hallway by jumping like a bunny rabbit. Quake III was released on December 2nd, 1999 to mixed reviews. Ultimately, Quake III would become regarded as one of the best Quakes ever, and debatably the final iteration of Quake. It set various standards that would continue throughout the series with little to no change, and if there were, the fans of the series would make sure there is hell to pay. Quake III would launch with 26 maps, 9 weapons, and a variety of modes including Deathmatch and Capture the Flag. Quake III might not have had the charm that 1 and 2 had, but ultimately would take on a more serious role within the franchise, pushing competitive play to the forefront, and people loved this. This is where esports really started to grow and pick up traction, alongside other games like Counter-Strike. Between the launch of Quake III and Quake IV rose an individual that would forever change competitive gaming, becoming the second icon for esports. His name was Jonathan Fatality Wendell. Fatality would dominate in Quake, Unreal Tournament, and Painkiller. He would also compete in other games like Counter-Strike and Aliens vs Predator. On top of competing, he was using his professional gamer status to build a business. He would be the first professional gamer to appear on TV, being featured in MTV's True Life. The episode was titled "I'm a Gamer," giving Fatality 12 minutes of on-air time where he would detail who he is, what he does, and how he prepares for competitive events. Funny enough, in the episode, he was practicing for an Unreal Tournament event rather than Quake. Fatality held the record for highest esports earning until 2013, where a StarCraft player known as Lee Jae-dong took his title. Quake III would mark the highest point in the series, with the franchise slowly declining in popularity until becoming an obscure game that most people today may have heard of but never have seen or played. This would become even more prevalent with the release of Quake IV. The development of Quake IV was already interesting from the start. Instead of id Software making the game, it was instead handed over to Raven Software. Id would supervise the development of the game, retaining creative control. It utilized id Tech 4, which featured more optimizations and changes, which would allow for a smoother user experience. With the changes from 3 to 4, the newer engine introduced newer quirks like crouch sliding and ramp jumping to the franchise, which helps speed up the pace of the game. Raven Software wanted Quake IV to have a higher focus on the single-player aspect, which confused most players. The Quake fanbase had come to love the competitive nature of the game, and would rather a multiplayer-focused experience. Regardless of how fans felt, Quake IV would be a direct sequel to Quake II, featuring Marine Corporal Matthew Kane. With the Macron being killed, it was up to Kane and his squad to secure Stragos. Just like Quake II, Kane's transport ship while landing was attacked, and this caused him to be separated from his squad. Throughout the game, Kane will find his scattered squad mates and complete objectives, such as destroying Strag aircraft hangars or disabling defense systems. This progresses the story to a point where Kane and his squad would make it to the USS Hannibal. His squad would get their next assignment: infiltrate and disrupt the Tetranode with an EMP bomb. Kane is tasked with defending the cargo transporter that houses the payload. This would prove to be harder than thought, and their forces were quickly dwindling. Kane was eventually one of the last people remaining. This forced him to complete the mission with Private Johann Strauss and Lance Corporal Nikolai Slidjonovich. After battling your way through the legions of Strag, Strauss figures out that you can destroy the communication hub by disabling the coolant systems. However, upon reaching the Tetranode, Kane is greeted by two network guardians, and to everyone's disbelief, the Macron. A fight ensues between Kane and the Macron, but Kane is no match and becomes incapacitated. Kane awakens in a Strag medical facility. He would then realize what is happening: Stragification. For the next 5 minutes, you were forced to watch the transformation from human to Strag. Kane would be dismembered and fitted with new cybernetic parts. After getting stabbed and cut open for the addition of his mind chip, Kane is rescued by his squad before the Strag can activate it. Kane and his squad would then fight their way through the medical facility and waste processing plant, which housed some grotesque sights. Eventually, before escaping, Kane would run into his old commander, who had been fully Stragified into a mechanical beast. Kane would then have to kill his old commander to escape, and so he did. The remaining members of Rhino Squad and Kane finally make it back to the USS Hannibal, where they realize that Kane's Stragified body can turn the tides of the war on Stragos. The new objective was to take the fight directly to the Strag by targeting the Strag Nexus core. The three main objectives are to infiltrate 3 data towers that control the Strag forces. After this point, the Nexus's shields would be disabled, and they can now activate a teleporter where Kane would travel to the center to find and kill the core brain. Upon arriving at the core brain's chamber, Kane is once again faced with the Macron, but this time he's ready. After a long fight with the Macron, Kane finally destroys him and fires his final volley at the brain, causing it to explode. Kane then returns to the USS Hannibal, where he celebrates with Rhino Squad on their victory. Kane would then receive word on new orders, and the game cuts to credits. Quake IV would be a launch title for Microsoft's Xbox 360 and would accumulate mixed reviews from both console and PC gamers alike due to outdated graphics and a less than optimal launch. Ultimately, fans from id Software hated the game, and this would cause a permanent stain on the id Software history. It was clear at this point that Quake was no longer the titan it once was. The series would go dormant for a few years while id Software worked on other titles, struggling to reclaim its position at the top of the gaming industry. Quake IV would mark the departure of Adrian Carmack, leaving the last founder, John Carmack, atop an empire slowly crumbling. In 2007, id Software announced at Quakecon that they would be releasing a free-to-play browser-based game around Quake III, with its name being Quake Zero. In 2008, the game would be renamed to Quake Live due to people buying the domain and refusing to sell it. Quake Live was set to have an invite-only beta in late 2008 and early 2009, where participants invited would gain additional invites for their friends who could also get invites. Quake Live would then proceed to turn from invite-only to open beta on February 24, 2009, and queues were put in place so the site wouldn't go down due to an influx of traffic. Within the first 6 hours of launching, over 110,000 people had signed up and started playing. Quake Live primarily ran off advertisements to fund the game, but at Quakecon 2009, it was revealed that the site wasn't generating enough revenue to keep it going, so id Software implemented subscription-based services which would allow for users to gain access to more arenas and modes. The game would remain in its open beta state until 2010, where the game launched with free-to-play, premium, and a pro subscription model. After 3 years of the game being alive, it was announced that Quake Live would be transferring to a standalone client because major browsers stopped supporting NPAPI plugins. 2014 came and Quake Live would see its biggest update yet, trying to integrate new players with a population that had been playing arena shooters for almost 2 decades at this point. It introduced auto-jumping so players wouldn't need to time their jumps to utilize strafe jumping. Loadouts were also added alongside a heavy machine gun. This was regarded by many people who had been playing Quake Live for years as the worst update yet. In 2015, the game would see yet another major update, with 1 year of code updates and optimizations and 4,500 map fixes. Quake Live would also switch over to Steam and integrate Steamworks API. This caused every player to lose their accumulated statistics. The subscription-based model was also removed, and instead, users would have to pay $10 to play the game. If you owned a Quake Live account before this point though, you could claim the game for free on Steam. In between the announcement and development of Quake Live, Splash Damage alongside id Software released Enemy Territory Quake Wars. Quake Wars released on September 28, 2007 to extremely positive reviews. ETQW was primarily focused on the multiplayer side of things and would be unlike any Quake up to this point in time. It featured large-scale 12v12 combat with gameplay similar to Battlefield. It takes place before the events of Quake II and features no story mode. Each map covers a wide range of objectives for one side to win. Enemy Territory Quake Wars was regarded by many on PC to be a great game, except for its core audience that had been built up from the previous 11 years. ETQW would eventually fade into obscurity when its master servers would be turned off. During the maintenance of Quake Live, id Software would see its biggest loss yet. John Carmack would leave the studio on November 23, 2013 to pursue a CTO role at Oculus. After a dedicated life at id Software, Carmack had finally said goodbye to not only his company, but also the many different games he had developed, designed, and most importantly programmed. John Carmack was regarded by the fans of id Software as a genius, and a stubborn asshole by his colleagues, but ultimately was loved by everybody. With all the founders of id Software now gone, the company would enter a somewhat dormant state alongside Quake. From being published by Activision, the studio would be sold to Bethesda to develop a reboot for Doom. The release of Doom would put the studio back to their previous status as one of the best developers inside the gaming industry. From here, they would continue updating Doom until Quakecon 2016, where id Software would show their latest project. The game was eventually to be called Quake Champions and feature iconic characters from the Quake universe. In 2017, the closed beta for the game would go live and release to a less than pleased fanbase, with many calling the game not a real Quake. Quake Champions would suffer from multiple development issues because Bethesda outsourced parts of the game to Saber Interactive. This caused the engine of the game to be made on part id Tech and part Saber Tech, which caused multiple problems early on and later into the game's life. While Quake Champions forever remains in early access, it still steadily receives updates from what many people believe is the only person working on the game, Sync Error. Whether this is the case or not, Quake Champions is holding its own 25th birthday with the addition of a Quake I Ranger model, a port of the Dark Zone map, alongside Ranger's Axe. Microsoft recently bought Bethesda and its subsidiaries from ZeniMax. With this came a new hope for fans of Quake, hoping Microsoft would put more time and attention to Quake Champions, but so far this seems to be a dying wish. With the very recent passing of E3, Microsoft is celebrating 20 years of Halo, and rightfully so. However, there is no mention of Quake anywhere within the conference. But there was more celebration for Doom and its recent success of its new DLC. While Doom will always be id Software's golden child, I can't help but think that Quake will always be the ugly duckling when it comes to Microsoft, Bethesda, and id Software. Looking back at the company's history is important to recognize and understand just how influential id Software was, not only as a company, but how its individual founders each contributed in a major way to the gaming industry. id Software not only produced games that would accumulate a die-hard fanbase, but also inspire the many people who were touched by the company. id Software will always be remembered as a company that pushed PC gaming to the top of the industry, helping raise almost 3 generations of gamers. Thank you John Romero, Adrian Carmack, Tom Hall, and all the employees that worked at id Software, and finally, John Carmack, for your contributions to gaming.